Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. I just wanted to share some things with you on why I think Islam is brilliant for not allowing and condoning bid'ah innovation, right? Now, what is really unique is that I've noticed some Christian, okay, I shouldn't call them a Christian influencer. Rather, they're a social media influencer. And this particular individual blends in a lot of heathen and pagan stuff into their Christianity, and they heavily mock dogma and orthodoxy and almost appear to be making up their own version of Christianity and bringing in non-Christian ideas into their personal life philosophy that actually would make them a heretic, would actually bring them out of the fold of Christianity. And when I witness this, it always reminds me, like, you always got to be careful and make sure you're not adopting things and saying that there's something to be found in this, therefore you adopt it. What I like to do is I like to study different things, but I do not blend them in to Islam. I do what Islam says, I study what Islam says, and I do my best to fulfill that, meditate upon it, and apply it. But I like to study other things because I'm a nerd, but I know you do not apply everything you learn. If I found something with wisdom that Buddha says, I do not apply any Buddhistic concept into my life because it does not belong in Islam. And if it's not something the companions did or the Prophet condoned or nothing found in the Hadith, I try to be very careful with pardon me, with what I practice, right? I think this is what makes Islam so brilliant, because it doesn't like bid'ah, it doesn't like innovation, it doesn't like shirk, and they try to stick to the straight path, what is part of the Rashidun period, of the rightly guided caliphs, and to try to make sure that we're doing things that Allah loves and that Allah approves of. Whereas with this particular individual, I'll hear them talk to people, or people will say things to this individual, and clearly they'll mention astrology, they'll mention points of other faiths, and sometimes you can see this person completely adding in these things to their own lifestyle, and then mocking everyone else who doesn't see their innovation as something condonable. It's really quite fascinating, because can you call yourself a Christian if you reject what the Christian scholars say and you refuse to study what the Calvinist scholars have said, what the Catholic scholars have said, what the Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, if you refuse to study them, but you are willing to listen to pagans and heathens, one must wonder what path you are upon. And if you read the Old Testament, you should see that Jehovah Yahweh is a jealous God. You should be mindful to not disobey and not risk hellfire. For me, let me tell you something. If someone says, I'd rather go to hell than be in paradise or heaven with people like so-and-so, I have to be careful and think to myself, who would say they would prefer to be in hell? Because if you truly fear God, you would never ask for hell. If you are righteous, why would you want to be among the condemned? Why would you say such a thing? Me as a Muslim, we ask to spare us the trial of the grave, spare us the trial of the Ad-Dajjal, to help us to earn paradise, I beg Allah to let me earn paradise. I don't want to go to hell. And I won't joke about it either. I think when your faith is actually strong and you're sincere, you want to make sure you're not doing something that Allah is going to punish you for. You know? It's very, very interesting. Because the only way Christianity can fix itself is if it returns to its orthodoxy. The New Age, hippie, liberal interpretations is what has destroyed Christianity. And if a Christian starts adopting pagan beliefs and then starts making excuses saying paganism isn't bad, it's an insult to the literal people of Europe who decimated the pagans to spread their version of Christianity. Christians don't like pagans, they're not supposed to. Muslims didn't like pagans where they were from either, or polytheists. So if somebody claims to be a Christian but is minimizing paganism and making excuses and making it sound soft, it's almost like the Christian scholars in the 13th century, the 11th, 12th century, they were way more tuned in than we are today. If they heard that, which is impossible, I know, but if they heard it, they'd be rolling in their graves. Think of all the warriors in Christianity who died fighting, killing pagans, just to hear a supposedly Christian influencer try to soften the hearts of the Christians towards pagans, and pagans are closer to occultists. Think about that subversion and diversion. It's not healthy. That's why I really appreciate Islam, because we hold each other to say, no, that's bid'ah, we don't do that. And I really appreciate that. I really found that to be quite helpful, because it makes you understand that we want to have a good record on the day of accounting. And since shirk is so bad, we don't want to associate partners with Allah and His dominion and His worship. And if you start blending in certain beliefs that go against what Allah promotes, you're going to be in some big trouble. That's why you have to be very careful who you take your knowledge from. Very careful. I mean, I feel really bad for the Christians because they're losing their good scholars, and now they have e-celebrities ruining their orthodoxy. Islam has done really well online to say, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the path of the Salaf, the orthodoxy, has done very well, I'd say, in trying to keep that spirit alive, right? And plenty of books of religious orthodoxy exist in Islam, and both ancient and modern, whereas in the Christian texts, their magnificent scholars have long perished. And let me tell you something. If someone claims to be a Christian and they mock and call names to Christian scholars, I would not take religious knowledge at all from them. Because if this person is soft towards pagans and heathens, but mocks the scholars of Christianity, this person is not someone you should take religious knowledge from. Because religion isn't a joke. You should be careful. You may like this person's personality because they're a social media influencer, but they cannot save you on Judgment Day. And if they disrespect scholars, and they're calling themselves like, oh, I'm not a prophet, but I'm kind of like this, or I'm kind of like that, or they stroke their own ego so much, and they don't say, by the permission of God, or by, oh, to thank God for this, or God willing. They're taking too much credit for themselves, which is exactly what heathens and pagans do, and Luciferians as well. Whereas in Islam, we constantly say, by the permission of Allah, if Allah wills, all praise is due to Allah. Like, God is the greatest. We have constant phrases that remind us that Allah is the one who allows everything. And all knowledge comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you respect the scholars. You should try to be one. And religious knowledge is sacred knowledge and is not a joke. and you should be careful who you get it from, and always try to do your best to stick to the right path in the orthodoxy. Okay? And you don't compliment who Allah hates. And that's why I like reading these Christian texts, is because you can see who's a real Christian and who's not. I can't measure a Christian, but because I'm not a Christian scholar. However, I do want to be a scholar of theology. But what I will say is, digging into the really heavy hitters of their field, you can see who's a charlatan, who's a sophist, who's inventing, and who is leading by their cult of ego, by their own interpretation that is so far off from the actual doctrine that you must be careful. Because you just gotta be careful, man. Like, I fear Allah. I would never want to blend something in to my faith. I study so I can learn and discern. So I know the difference, so I can understand how to critique the difference and to differentiate and have a straight path, but also to be able to give dawah to those individuals and write good essays about why I prefer my system instead of theirs. My intentions are pure, inshallah. God willing, they'll stay that way. But if somebody consistently mocks those who follow the dogma, those who follow the rites, those who appreciate the scholars and correct them on certain things they got wrong, you must be careful. Now, I understand some Christian churches have been co-opted. They have FBI agents in there, secret liberals in there. It is very, very sad how many plants there are in Christian churches to lead their flocks astray. This is quite sad. And soon they'll do it with Muslims, but they'll do it in a worse manner by getting a drag queen or a woman to lead or something else that is totally against the orthodoxy. That's the way they do it, so that they break down the chain of command and the chain of tradition, right? So I understand the Christians are struggling heavily right now with keeping the innovation out of their faith and keeping their members on what their God has decreed for them, right? And what their scholars, who are way smarter than them today, have said, this is how you should do it, right? I understand there's a balance and a nuance where we learn ourselves, we adopt things, we try to understand ourselves, but we must always try to look at what the scholars say, what another scholar says, and another, and another, and another, and we're always working on acquiring knowledge. But if someone mocks that pursuit, but likes to stir the pot around that subject, you must be wary, because this person is playing games with your psychology, and you, by following them on that particular theological path, are playing with hellfire. And you don't want to go to hell, because a good rhetorician, a good speaker who entertains you was able to convince you to abandon the ideals of the orthodoxy in favor for their innovation, their bid'ah, their new interpretation that is unfounded traditionally. You gotta be careful. You gotta be careful. And if you find yourself getting around too many people who change your religion into something it isn't, and think that that opinion is valid, that they're allowed to do that, well, then clearly they have failed their Christian duties, and if they're Muslims, they failed in their Muslim duties. If someone is trying to be a scholar, an intellectual, an academic, that's quite different, because they have, like, I'm not gonna, how do I put it? We know what we are doing, and why we are doing it, and how to do it. We have a different intention, because we know it is for the sake of knowledge itself, and for the sake of Allah to utilize our brains in the best way, and we know that everything we think, everything we write, it only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not from our own selves. But if there's someone who is not trying to be an intellectual scholar and is not trying to study theology, in philosophy, and then they go around preaching when they haven't even done the basic groundwork, and then they mock orthodoxy, they mock their traditions, they mock the scholars, they mock the normative way. That is bad, because you must examine how Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, he did it with his 95 Theses with evidence. His rebellion had evidence, and he used first-hand sources, right? But if someone who is a social media influencer is rejecting people who go with the orthodoxy and is giving you pagan, heathen, new age, numerology, gematria, other crap to then argue against the Christian orthodoxy, this is not good. This is not good. And this is why I think Islam protects us members, because we are encouraged all the time to make sure we must do what is sunnah, which is based upon the hadiths, the narrations and the sayings and the customs and the behaviors of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his biography, the seerah, and then the Quran. We have our texts, we have our good scholars, we have our minds, and we fear Allah, right? We have tafsir, we have so many wonderful things to help us. So we have no excuse to fall for the innovations and misguidance of an innovator. But the Christians, they have similar texts, but their flock has neglected studying. And so I would warn the Christians, and also remind us Muslims, that if you're following a social media influencer, they may be good at one thing and may be terrible at theology. And so you must understand, if you're going to keep following an individual who is terrible at theology and is making things up and changing their mind and not really understanding what it is they're talking about, and they mock people who do, then you must know you do not take your religion from them, because to gamble on them is to risk your judgment day reward and to risk a huge punishment. They can entertain you with certain things that they do, but once they breach the topic of religion, that is when you should fast forward, reject what they say, or at least take it with a grain of salt, and then fact check that with a proper scholar to make sure that what they have said doesn't have blended paganism in it. Okay? Be very mindful of that. Study Christian history. I've been studying Al-Tabari. Where is it? This is one of them. I don't know if you can see, but he's a pretty cool dude, and he has so many books. But I've dug into Islamic history. I mean, it's just there's so much to learn. So if someone's on the path of knowledge, they're sincere in their searching. But if somebody doesn't have the time and the dedication to do that, but constantly talks about theology, this is how you must know you need to be careful. Because there's nothing worse than somebody who doesn't study but talks about subjects as if they know them, and then mocks those scholars who do study more than them. This is very bad. Be careful, because this person might turn into a cult of personality, where they start to think that they have the right to change God's laws, to reinterpret them, and to shift the traditional way without having the proper training, and not even doing it in a formulaic, critical analysis and textual analysis way, but rather shooting off the cuff, ranting, being highly emotional and chaotic in their mind. So indeed, be careful with individuals like that. And if those individuals won't let you speak up, and they'll ban you, and they just want yes men around, you should be even more careful with an individual like that. Be very careful. Be very careful. Don't risk your reward with your maker. Take it very seriously. Take it very seriously. Oh, Just wanted to say that.